Hello everyone. Today I will talk about Kant's theory and use of testimony. There are only a handful of publications on Kant's account of testimony. All of them treated the account in light of today's epistemology of testimony, and none of them paid any attention to how Kant himself used testimony. As a result, they overlooked what in my view is the most important feature of testimony for Kant. That is, testimony plays a merely passive role and is completely subordinate to reason. The passive nature of testimony becomes obvious when we consider the place of a witness in Kant's court of justice. Kant alludes to both the civil law and the common law systems in his legal metaphors. In the common law system, the lawyers use an adversarial procedure to determine facts in front of the judge and the jury. Each lawyer cross-examines the witnesses in the interest of his own party. In the civil law system, the judge uses the inquisitorial procedure to determine facts by interrogating the witnesses in reference to an existing set of codified laws. In this presentation, I will examine critically Kant's rationalist account of testimony by studying his use of testimony in natural science. I begin by laying out the basics of Kant's theory of testimony as a source of cognition. I then tease out the rationalist character of that theory by looking at the guiding role that hypotheses play in the investigation of nature. In the process, I raise a worry about the combined threat of confirmation bias and belief perseverance. Such a threat is real insofar as Kant thinks that hypotheses are established largely on certain rational principles before they can serve to guide a fruitful investigation of nature, and that one must approach personal observations and testimonies alike under the direction of such hypotheses. To illustrate this worry, I will examine how Kant uses testimonies in his study of race, which he treats as a subject of natural science. Kant treats testimony as a source of cognition. Our cognition is of three kinds, he states. We cognize something through our own direct experience, through reason, and through belief in the testimony of another. A testimony purports to represent a fact that has been directly experienced by someone. A witness is one who asserts an experience. By contrast, one who asserts universal judgments of reason as true is not a witness, and these assertions do not count as testimonies. In making this distinction, Kant is alluding to the contrast between historical and rational cognition. Historical cognition is cognition through sensory experience, as in history and geography. Rational cognition is cognition from principles that in turn have a priori grounds, as in philosophy and mathematics. Kant is particularly interested in the relation between historical and philosophical cognition. To begin with, we need historical cognition, especially cognition through other people's testimony, to give us the material we need for philosophical cognition. Historical cognition must lay the material ground for all rational cognition, Kant states. The brooder who shuts himself up in his room and wants to attain much rational cognition will not get far if he has not first acquired historical cognition by means of experience from books or from contact, from association with other people. We draw on other people's testimony as a source of our historical cognition, especially when we cite their written reports. The act of citation signals trust. After all, Kant says, if I did not intend to hold something to be true on the testimony of someone else, I would not cite him, namely, call him as a witness. This brings us to Kant's account of what makes a credible witness. He divides the criteria of credibility into three categories. Logically, the witness must be able to obtain an experience, which presupposes a capacity for rational reflection, to preserve the obtained experience faithfully in memory, and to communicate that experience to others, especially in writing. Morally, the witness must have a sincere will to report his experience truthfully. Pragmatically, the witness has nothing to gain from giving a false report, namely, there is no conflict of interest, but has every reason to give a true one. The pragmatic constraint of honor, Kant argues, makes the learned men in modern days particularly trustworthy as witnesses. For unlike in the ancient time, nowadays everyone had to be quite exact in his reports. And if someone deviated from the truth only a bit in his writings, he was ridiculed and dishonored. As a result, historical belief carries with it astonishing credibility, because the witness must have so many properties in order to speak the truth. For that reason, Kant concludes, one can rely on the modern learned man's testimony as much as, or in some cases, even more than one can trust one's own experience. This conclusion is tempered, however, by the flip side of Kant's account of the relation between historical and philosophical cognitions. One who possesses gigantic erudition in terms of historical cognition, Kant argues, may still be like a one-eyed cyclops, missing the second eye of true philosophy, by means of which reason suitably uses this means of historical knowledge. This point about the need to look at historical cognition with the eye of true philosophy underpins Kant's rationalist approach to testimony. To illustrate, let's return to his legal metaphor. In the inquisitorial civil law system in particular, a judge seeks to establish facts by interrogating witnesses. In Kant's terminology, this is a process of obtaining historical cognition, which provides material for judicial deliberation. The judge, however, does not just passively take in what a witness has to say. To the contrary, she typically plays a proactive role. For one thing, she must do some preparation in advance if she is to interrogate the witness effectively. In particular, she must come up with a plan for how to question the witness in a way that will extract all and only the relevant information. This plan typically involves a working hypothesis about the case being adjudicated. For another, what kind of uptake a testimony gets in the judge's subsequent deliberation is a matter of philosophical understanding, namely an understanding of how the testimony connects with everything else that she deems pertinent, including the applicable laws and their interpretations. Kant alludes to this legal metaphor in a well-known passage about natural philosophy from the Critique of Pure Reason. I will return to a more detailed version of this passage later. For now, let me briefly explain Kant's views about the relation between hypothesis and the use of testimony in natural science, to shed further light on the passive and subordinate nature of testimony. Testimony occupies a salient place in Kant's writings on at least two subjects of natural science. One is earthquake, the other is race. I will look at some examples from his writings on race later in this talk. Now, I want to draw your attention to the combined threat of confirmation bias and belief perseverance, which are the number one cognitive biases that today's scientists know that they have to watch out for. Kant hints at that threat while warning against unreasonable attachment to one's own hypothesis. He who will not get rid of false hypotheses because he has contrived them and they seem so probable to him is like a man who has raised a child with much effort and care, and who afterwards does not want to reject it, so as not to lose all his work, effort, and expense. It's important to note here that the man is beholden to a hypothesis not in spite of knowing that it is false, but because it seems very probable to him. This point is important to natural science, because according to Kant, an investigator of nature simply cannot conduct his investigation without the help of hypotheses. This has to do with the nature of scientific discovery, which does not happen by mere chance, but relies on a methodical procedure that begins with hypothesis. So Kant says, to discover something, we must always first presuppose something here, namely, begin with a hypothesis, from which to begin our course of investigation. For to venture forth blindly, trusting good luck until one stumbles over a stone and finds a piece of ore and subsequently a lode as well, is indeed bad advice for inquiry. This indispensability of hypothesis is also true of the legal domain. All judges make hypothesis claims. That is, when a judge interrogates a witness, she does so under the guidance of a working hypothesis about the case at hand. Meanwhile, she should be ready to reject or modify the initial hypothesis on better investigation. But this open-mindedness may not be easily practiced in natural science, given how Kant understands hypotheses and their relation to empirical observations, including testimonies. A hypothesis, on Kant's account, is a presupposition that contains a sufficient causal explanation of given phenomena. Epistemically, a hypothesis can achieve an analog or approximation to first certainty, not by having a high degree of probability, however. The derivation of many consequences determines the probability of a hypothesis, Kant argues, but does not affect its certainty. For the same consequences can be drawn from other grounds. The approximation to certainty is rather due to other fully certain elements of the hypothesis, especially the possibility and intelligibility of the supposed ground of explanation, and the unity of such a ground in that it can explain given phenomena without needing supplementary hypothesis. The important thing to know here is that those fully certain elements of a hypothesis are established a priori, in accordance with certain principles of reason. This point is best captured in the passage about how reason approaches nature that I mentioned earlier. Here's the passage. Reason, in order to be taught by nature, must approach nature with its principles in one hand, and in the other hand, the experiments thought out in advance in accordance with those hypotheses, with those principles. Yet, in order to be instructed by nature, not like a pupil, but like an appointed judge, who compels witnesses to answer the questions he puts to them. Thus, where reason would not be able to know of itself, and has to learn from nature, it has to seek in the latter in accordance with what reason itself puts into the nature. On this picture, an investigator of nature begins his investigation with a working hypothesis that he has formulated in accordance with certain rational principles. Ideally, our investigator should be prepared to reject or revise his hypothesis based on further data that he will collect through his personal observations and or his fellow investigators' testimonies. But if our investigator is already confident that his hypothesis satisfies the relevant principles of reason And this very hypothesis will guide his process of collecting, sorting, and analyzing data. It's hard to see what would prevent him from cherry-picking the data in service of his initial hypothesis. In other words, it's difficult to see how our investigator could mitigate the combined influence of confirmation bias and belief perseverance that I mentioned earlier. To illustrate this difficulty, let's take a look at the use of testimony in some of Kant's writings about race. Kant has 3 dedicated publications on race from mid-1770s through late 1780s. The last of these publications is Kant's response to George Forster, an experienced naturalist who took part in Captain Cook's second voyage to the Pacific, and who had published an article in 1786 to criticize the theory of race that Kant put forward in the 1785 essay. As part of his response to Forster's criticism, Kant appeals to a philosophical jury composed of mere investigators of nature. He is confident that the jury would take his side, if not because he has more empirical facts in his favor, then at least because Forster's mode of explanation allegedly unhinges reason from its first principles and permits it to wander about in unbounded imaginings. Now, a major point of contention between Kant and Forster is whether human beings who are as different as blacks and whites have a single origin or different origins. I will focus on how Kant defends his hypothesis of monogenesis, partly by invoking principles of reason to safeguard it, and partly by selectively citing testimonies, primarily travel reports, that support it, while dismissing others that don't. To begin with, Kant's natural scientific theory of race makes 3 basic claims. First, there are 4 principal races by skin color: white, yellow, black, and copper red. Second, skin color is the singular basis for this racial classification because of all the hereditary human characteristics, it alone is persistently hereditary. Finally, different races nevertheless belong to the same human species, originating from a single phylum. This last claim is a claim of monogenesis. More specifically, Kant's monogenetic hypothesis contains the following propositions. First, there are certain germs and predispositions in a single original phylum that defines the human species. Those original germs and predispositions develop differently in different climates, and if ancient people resided in a given climate for a very long time, they might develop adaptive characteristics that would become irreversible or persistently hereditary in subsequent migrations to other climates. Now, skin color is one, and indeed the only one of these characteristics, according to Kant. Provided there are 4 basic climates in terms of hot or cold sun and dry or humid air, there emerged in the course of human history 4 radically different skin colors, and hence 4 principal races, all from the same human phylum. Kant first conducts an a priori assessment of this hypothesis against the competing hypotheses, which include not only polygenesis, but also the hypothesis of mere mechanical influence and even the hypothesis of mere chance. The way Kant describes the procedure for such an a priori assessment of the alternative hypotheses is telling. He says, I look only at the particular maxim of reason from which each person who investigates human differences departs, and according to which he generally manages to find facts which favor it, and afterward I seek out my maxim, Now, if I find my maxim proved exactly in keeping with the use of reason in natural science, and the only one fit for a consistent mode of thought, then I follow it without heeding those alleged facts, which borrow their credibility and sufficiency for the assumed hypothesis almost exclusively from that already chosen maxim, and to which facts one can moreover oppose 100 other facts without effort. From this a priori standpoint, what Kant finds most attractive about his own hypothesis are two things. First, it satisfies the rational maxim that nature always preserves itself by supposing certain germs and predispositions in the original human phylum as the special first powers of nature that suffice to preserve the human species in existence anywhere on earth. Second, the same supposition also satisfies the interest of reason in systematic unity by providing a single original principle or highest explanatory ground for the phenomenon of radically different skin colors. Besides this a priori backing, Kant also seeks to establish the exceptional intelligibility of his hypothesis by telling a story of how four radically different skin colors might have developed purposively, and yet in a law-governed way, from the assumed principle of an original phylum, namely as adaptive responses to 4 types of climate in accordance with the laws of chemistry. Assuming phlogiston and salts as the fundamental chemical agents, he seeks, for example, to show how the blacks developed their black skin and how the American Indians obtained their red skin. To supplement his arguments, Kant cites travel reports here and there. He's often cavalier in doing so, as Forster was quick to notice and to criticize. Kant's reaction to the criticism is twofold. First, he rejects what he calls merely contingent perceptions in favor of true observations that are conducted in accordance with experiments designed on the basis of a working hypothesis. With this distinction, Kant feels warranted even to intentionally make himself blind to actual experiences reported by travelers. So, when Forster criticized him for misusing a seafarer's report about the skin color of the South Sea Islanders, for example, Kant's response is first to blame his own bad memory and then to dismiss travel reports as mostly irrelevant to his hypothesis anyways. What would be relevant, he insists, are experiments such as transporting the people from their native climate to an entirely different climate to see what happens after they've lived in a new climate for a long time. On the other hand, Kant does not hesitate to call someone as a witness when that person's testimony is friendly to his hypothesis. The most striking example of this is when, in an attempt to showcase the explanatory power of his hypothesis that the prolonged adaptive response to a given climate can generate irreversible racial characteristics in a people, Kant claims that after some of the already adapted inhabitants of the old region of warm climate were driven to the new region of cold climate, they have never been able to bring about in their progeny, such as the Creole Negroes or the Indians under the name of gypsies, a sort that would be fit for farmers or manual laborers. To substantiate this allegation, Kant calls as a witness James Tobin, a pro-slavery plantation owner who was arguing against the abolitionist Reverend James Ramsey. I include here Kant's summary of Tobin's testimony for your reference, but I will not read it. Instead, I will draw your attention to how Kant's theory of testimony and his actual practice seems seem to come apart here. By Kant's theory of testimony, as I outlined it earlier, a slave owner like James Tobin should never be trusted as a witness about the people he enslaved. In practice, however, Kant seems eager to use Tobin's testimony to showcase the power of his explanatory model. That is, if a people have a characteristic that remains constant across different climates, this phenomenon can only be explained in the same manner in which he has explained the persistent heredity of skin color. Should one not conclude from this observation by Tobin, Kant asks rhetorically, that in addition to the faculty to work, there is also an immediate drive to activity, which is especially interwoven with certain natural predispositions, and that Negroes do not bring any more of this impetus into other climates and pass it on to their offspring than was needed for their preservation in their old motherland and had been received from nature, and that this inner predisposition extinguishes just as little as the externally visible one, namely skin color. I will leave this passage at that and close my talk with a few concluding thoughts, or rather, questions. To this end, let's return to Kant's view about the relation between historical and philosophical cognition. Earlier, I quoted him as saying that one needs the eye of true philosophy to use the mass of historical knowledge, and that the philosophical eye is the eye of reason. This view underscores Kant's treatment of testimonies in his study of race. He alludes to this in his review of Herder's ideas for the philosophy of the history of humanity, where he claims, from a multiplicity of descriptions of countries, namely travel reports, one can prove, if one wants to, that Americans and Negroes are each a race sunk beneath the remaining members of the human species in their mental predispositions. But on the other hand, by just as apparent records, that as regards their natural predispositions, they are to be estimated equal to every other inhabitant of the world, so it remains to the choice of the philosopher whether he wants to assume differences of nature or wants to judge everything in accordance with the principle, all is as with us. Now, we know that Kant's philosophical choice is to assume natural differences, so much so that mental predispositions must have been developed differently along racial lines, albeit from the same original human phylum. To the extent that this philosophical decision determines how Kant treats testimonies about human beings around the globe, it's hard to see what would convince him to give up his hypothesis of racialized human development. In making this point, I do not mean to suggest that there is something wrong with Kant's theories of hypothesis and testimony. I agree with him when he said to Forster that if it's all too true that some so-called rash reasoners are so careless as to import their ideas into the observation itself, this malpractice does not invalidate the rule that theory guides data collection, whether through personal observations or through other investigators' testimonies. I just don't see what makes Kant so confident that he is not one of those rash reasoners. Or to put the question more broadly, is there anything in Kant's philosophical system that can offer potentially effective mitigating strategies against his biased treatment of testimonies? I would like to hear your thoughts on this question. Thank you.